What would you do if a mechanic tried to scam you out of thousands of dollars? Most people would argue. Maybe call the manager. But Big Shaq? He bought the whole shop. When Shaq pulled into a small auto repair shop for a quick fix, he didn't expect to be treated like an ATM. The mechanic smirked, jacked up the price, and thought he had won. But he had no idea who he was messing with. By the time Shaq was done, the scammer had a broom in his hand and a brand new boss. So, how did Shaq turn a $4,000 scam into a lesson the entire internet would never forget? Let's find out. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty roadside auto shop. Shaq pulled his SUV into the lot, stretching his arms as he stepped out. It had been a long drive, and all he needed was a quick tire fix before heading home. But the second he set foot on the cracked pavement, a greasy-looking mechanic near the entrance smirked and muttered under his breath, "Jackpot." Shaq's ears caught it immediately. He'd been around long enough to recognize that tone, the kind that meant someone saw an easy target. The shop itself looked like it had seen better days. The paint on the sign was peeling, and the waiting area had a single rusted-out bench. But despite the run-down exterior, the garage was buzzing with business. Cars were lined up in the service bays, and workers hustled around. But something felt off. Shaq's eyes landed on the mechanic who had spoken. He was in his late 40s, with thinning hair slicked back and a smudged, oil-stained uniform that barely hid his beer belly. His name tag read Rick, and he was already eyeing Shaq's SUV like a predator sizing up its prey. Shaq walked toward the front desk, his massive frame making heads turn as he approached. Before he could say a word, Rick stepped in front of him, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got some car trouble, big guy?" Rick's grin was all teeth, his eyes already calculating. "Just need a quick tire check," Shaq said, keeping his voice even. "Think it's running low." Rick let out a slow whistle, shaking his head dramatically. "Oh, it's never just a quick fix, man. You'd be surprised what we find when we take a closer look." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? Well, let's just start with the tire." Rick nodded but made no move to inspect the car. Instead, he leaned against the hood, drumming his fingers. "You ever get a full inspection on this thing?" Shaq folded his arms. "Had one last week. Everything was fine." Rick's smirk widened. "Well, that's the thing about cars. Problems can pop up overnight." Shaq exhaled slowly, already knowing where this was headed. Rick hadn't even looked at the vehicle yet, but somehow, he was already implying that Shaq had major issues. Rick finally motioned for a younger mechanic to pop the hood. The kid, probably in his early 20s, looked nervous, like he didn't want to be involved but had no choice. He lifted the hood, and before even looking inside, Rick whistled again. "Damn," he muttered. "Yeah, I don't like what I'm seeing here." Shaq didn't flinch. He knew every trick in the book. Scammers like Rick thrived on people who panicked at the first sign of trouble. Rick turned back to him, shaking his head dramatically. "Looks like you got some major issues here, big guy." Shaq's expression didn't change. "Game on." Shaq's expression didn't waver as he stared at Rick, his arms still crossed. "What kind of issues?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Rick let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head like he had just discovered a disaster. "Man, where do I even start?" He leaned over the hood, peering into the engine like he actually knew what he was looking for. "Bad brakes, transmission's shot, oil leak, batteries running low, and I gotta tell you, you're lucky you even made it here in one piece." Shaq cocked his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. Bad brakes? Transmission shot? This car had just been serviced 2 weeks ago. Everything was in top shape. Rick wiped his hands on his rag and gave Shaq a fake sympathetic smile. "Look, man, I don't usually say this, but you're gonna need a full workup. And fast. Otherwise, you might as well start car shopping." Shaq let the words sit in the air for a moment, studying the mechanic's body language. Too confident, too rehearsed. He wasn't diagnosing a car, he was running a con. "How much we talking?" Shaq finally asked, keeping his tone neutral. Rick scratched his chin, pretending to calculate. "Well, let's see. Full diagnostics, labor, parts. He trailed off before looking up with a theatrical wince. About $4,000. Shaq blinked. 4,000. Rick shrugged. Hey, quality work ain't cheap. Shaq let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against his arm. Funny, 'cause when I pulled up here I only needed a tire check. Rick waved his hand dismissively. That's how it starts. But once we open her up, whole different story. Shaq smirked. Right. And you figured all that out just by glancing at the engine? Rick's confidence flickered for a second, but he quickly recovered. Been in this business a long time, big guy. You develop an eye for this sort of thing. Shaq nodded slowly like he was processing the information. All right, and what if I just want the tire checked? Rick clicked his tongue and shook his head. Wouldn't make sense, man. That's like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house that's falling apart. Shaq exhaled through his nose, resisting the urge to laugh. This guy was bold. Just then, a younger mechanic hesitated near the hood, looking nervous. He was probably in his early 20s, with a uniform that was a little too clean compared to the others. His eyes darted between Rick and Shaq like he wanted to say something but was too scared to. Shaq caught the hesitation. This kid knew something. Rick, oblivious to the tension, clapped his hands together. So, what's it gonna be? We starting the work now or what? Shaq met Rick's gaze, letting the silence stretch. Then finally, he uncrossed his arms and took a step closer. You sure about that, boss? His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Rick's smirk faltered, just for a second, but Shaq caught it. And that's when he knew. Rick slammed the hood of Shaq's SUV with a loud thunk, wiping his greasy hands on an already filthy rag. His smirk widened as he glanced up at the 7-foot basketball legend standing before him. Look, man, he said, crossing his arms. You either pay up or you walk home. Shaq let the words settle, tilting his head slightly. He could feel the tension in the air, the other mechanics lingering in the background, the younger guy shifting uncomfortably. But Rick? He was completely confident, completely comfortable in his little scam. That was the problem. Shaq sighed, rubbing his chin like he was actually considering the ridiculous offer. Damn, he muttered, shaking his head. That bad, huh? Rick nodded, his smirk deepening. Yep, and I don't take discounts. Shaq chuckled, a slow, deep rumble in his chest. Neither do I. For a split second, Rick's eyes flickered with confusion. Something about Shaq's demeanor must have felt off, but he shrugged it off, assuming he had just secured his next big payday. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. Let me just... He pretended to hesitate. Let me check something real quick. Rick rolled his eyes. Bro, you can check your bank account all you want. Bottom line is, I ain't starting the work until I see that cash. Shaq nodded, fingers casually tapping across his phone screen. What Rick didn't realize was that Shaq wasn't checking his bank account. He was sending a text. To Coleman, owner message. Call me. We got a situation. He slid his phone back into his pocket and looked up with the same easygoing smirk. All right, he said. Go ahead and write up the bill. Rick's grin widened as if he had just won a jackpot. He snatched a clipboard from the nearby workbench and started scribbling down nonsense. Oh, you won't regret it, man. This baby's gonna drive like new when we're done. Shaq casually leaned against the car, watching him work. So, tell me something, Rick. You ever had a celebrity client before? Rick didn't even look up. Couple athletes here and there. Nothing crazy. You're probably the biggest name to ever roll through. Shaq nodded thoughtfully. Cool, cool. And how many of them you try to scam? Rick's pen froze mid-scribble. For the first time, the mechanic hesitated. But only for a second. Then he forced out a laugh, shaking his head. Man, what are you talking about? This is just business, my guy. Shaq's smirk didn't fade. Yeah? 'Cause last I checked, business means giving customers what they actually need, not inflating prices just 'cause they can afford it. Rick scoffed, tossing the clipboard onto the counter. Listen, man. You either pay or you leave. Ain't nobody forcing you to be here. Shaq exhaled slowly, looking around the shop. The younger mechanic was still fidgeting in the background, his eyes darting from Shaq to Rick. The other employees had stopped pretending to work, clearly watching the exchange. Rick was too arrogant to see the writing on the wall. Shaq stretched his arms, cracking his knuckles. All right. Guess I better make a call then. Rick crossed his arms again. Yeah? To who? Shaq's smirk widened. Oh, just the owner. Rick's face fell, just slightly. Shaq saw it. The first crack in his confidence. You... Rick stammered, but quickly recovered. Man, the owner ain't got nothing to do with this. He trusts me to run this shop. Shaq shrugged. I'm sure he does. He reached into his pocket and tapped his phone again. But we'll see if that's still the case in about 5 minutes. Rick forced out another laugh. But this time, there was no real humor behind it. Yeah, whatever, big guy. He leaned against the counter, still trying to act like he had control. What's it gonna be? Pay or leave? Shaq simply smiled. I think I'll wait. Rick had no idea that his time was already up. Shaq let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, reaching into his pockets and patting them like a man who just realized he left his wallet at home. Man, that's a lot of cash, he muttered, shaking his head. Rick's smirk widened, his stained fingers drumming against the counter. Yeah, well, good work ain't cheap, big guy, he said smugly. Gotta pay up front. Shop policy. Shaq nodded, rubbing his chin like he was seriously contemplating his next move. His body language was easy, relaxed, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. Rick thought he had this in the bag. Shaq tilted his head. Mind if I call someone first? Rick scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Sure. Ain't gonna change nothing. Car ain't leaving without that bill getting paid. Shaq pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. His finger hovered for a second before pressing the call button. Rick watched him closely, still confident, still convinced he had Shaq trapped. Shaq held the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable. Yo, boss, he said after a few seconds. You free to meet me? Rick's smirk faltered, just a little. Boss? He repeated, narrowing his eyes. What? You calling your accountant or something? Shaq chuckled. Something like that. The call ended with a quick confirmation, and Shaq slipped the phone back into his pocket, still wearing that easygoing smile. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the counter. So, Rick, Shaq said, lowering his voice slightly, how long you been running this shop? Rick blinked, thrown off by the sudden change in conversation. A few years. You like it? Shaq asked, eyes locked onto him. Rick shrugged. Pays the bills. Keeps me busy. Shaq nodded slowly. And how long you been scamming people? Rick's smirk vanished completely. His fingers, which had been drumming the counter confidently just moments ago, suddenly froze. I don't know what you're talking about, man, Rick said quickly, forcing out a laugh. Shaq tilted his head, studying him like a lion eyeing its prey. Oh, I think you do, he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. Rick shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for backup. Listen, dude, I got customers to deal with. If you ain't paying, then... Before he could finish, the shop door swung open with a loud creak. Rick turned, expecting another random customer. Instead, a man in a sharp suit walked in, his eyes immediately scanning the shop like he owned the place. Rick's face drained of color. Shaq leaned back, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Oh, he said, grinning. Speak of the devil. Rick stammered, his hands gripping the counter now. Mr. Coleman? What are you doing here? The suited man, Mr. Coleman, the real owner of the shop, gave Rick a long, cold look before turning to Shaq. You the guy who called? He asked. Shaq nodded, smiling. Yeah, thinking about making an investment. Rick's mouth opened, then closed. His hands began to sweat. He finally realized he'd just played himself. The sound of heavy boots clicking against the concrete floor made Rick's stomach drop. He didn't need to turn around to know exactly who had just entered the shop. Still, when he finally forced himself to look, his worst fear was confirmed. Mr. Coleman, the real owner of the shop, stood in the doorway, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, his sharp gaze cutting through the greasy air of the garage like a knife. His presence alone demanded respect, and yet, at that moment, Rick looked like he wanted to vanish into thin air. His voice came out shaky. Mr. Coleman? What are you doing here? Coleman didn't answer him. Instead, his eyes landed on Shaq, sizing him up. Despite the casual hoodie and basketball shorts, The man in front of him exuded authority. "You the guy who called me?" Coleman asked, his deep voice echoing off the walls. Shaq nodded, his smirk never wavering. "Yeah," he said. "Thinking about making an investment." Rick blinked rapidly, his mind racing to catch up. Investment? What the hell was going on? Coleman crossed his arms. "An investment?" he repeated, his brow lifting with interest. Shaq nodded. "Yep, I figured, I could use a place like this." Coleman let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "This dump? You sure about that?" Rick swallowed hard. He knew Coleman had been wanting to sell for a while, but no one had made an offer. The business had potential, sure, but with Rick running things, customer complaints had been piling up. Shaq kept his cool. "How much you want for it?" The words hit the room like a bomb. Rick choked on his drink. "Wait, what?" His panic was instant. He gripped the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His brain scrambled for anything to stop this from happening. Hold on. Rick sputtered, stepping forward. We got customers, man. You can't just..." Coleman held up a hand, silencing him. "You don't speak," he said flatly. "You listen." Rick shut his mouth so fast he nearly bit his tongue. Coleman turned back to Shaq, his expression unreadable. "You serious about buying this place?" Shaq nodded, leaning casually against the counter. "Completely serious." Rick's palms started to sweat. "Sir, please, let's talk about this. I've been working here for years." Coleman didn't even look at him. "And in those years, you've turned this place into a scammer's paradise. I got customers calling me saying they've been cheated, but I kept you around because honestly, I didn't have the time to deal with it." Rick's face burned red. That's not true." Shaq cut in, his voice calm but firm. "You tried charging me $4,000 for a fake repair, Rick. How many others you pulled that on?" Rick opened his mouth, then shut it again. Coleman exhaled through his nose. "That's what I thought." Shaq pushed off the counter and clapped his hands together. "So, Coleman, let's talk numbers." Coleman smirked. "All right, let's step outside." As they walked toward the office, Rick stood frozen, his entire world crumbling around him. This couldn't be happening. But it was. The garage air felt thick, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Coleman, the shop's owner, folded his arms as he gave Shaq a long, measuring look. "You serious about buying?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with curiosity. Rick, standing a few feet away, looked like he'd seen a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Shaq, unfazed, gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said, adjusting his wristwatch. "I like the place. Needs some cleaning up, though." Rick snapped out of his trance. "Sir, this guy's just messing around," he blurted out, voice edged with panic. "He's not actually serious." Coleman didn't even glance at him. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapping a few times before looking back at Shaq. "All right, I'll sell it." Rick's stomach dropped. "Wait, what?" he stammered, his voice cracking. Coleman shrugged. "I've been thinking about selling for a while. This ain't a bad offer." Shaq smirked, tilting his head. "Let's do it then." Rick gripped the counter like it was his last lifeline. His breathing turned shallow, panic rising in his throat like bile. You can't just sell it like that." Coleman finally looked at him, his expression stone cold. "Why not?" Rick swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Because, who's gonna run it?" Shaq chuckled, stepping closer. "Well, not you." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Rick's face paled, his hands clenching into fists. "Hold on, I've been here for years. I know this shop inside out." Coleman exhaled through his nose. "Yeah? And you've been scamming customers for years, too." Rick's heart pounded. "Come on, sir, we can work something out. I can fix this." Shaq glanced around the shop, letting his eyes linger on the mechanics standing near the toolboxes, watching the whole scene unfold. They weren't stepping in, they weren't defending Rick, because no one wanted to. Shaq finally turned back to Coleman. "Paperwork ready?" Coleman nodded, pulling a folder from a drawer. "I can have it signed in an hour." Rick felt the room spinning. He had to stop this. He forced out a laugh, desperate now. "Okay, look, man, we got off on the wrong foot. I didn't know who you were. If I did, I wouldn't have..." Shaq raised a brow. "So what?" If I was just some regular dude, you would have scammed me and called it a day. Rick had no answer. His lips parted, but nothing came out. Coleman slid the folder onto the counter. Shaq, you sign this and the shop's yours. Shaq picked up the pen. Rick couldn't breathe. Wait, he croaked. What happens to me? Shaq paused mid-signature. Then he slowly looked up, smirking. Guess we'll see, won't we? Rick stood frozen, his face draining of color as Coleman slid the final paperwork across the counter. Shaq picked up the pen, his massive fingers easily dwarfing it as he signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes. The scratch of ink against paper was the only sound in the tense room. And just like that, Rick's world came crashing down. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. His deep voice rumbled with amusement. Hey, Rick, remember that $4,000 scam? Rick blinked rapidly, his breathing shallow. Listen, man, that was just a misunderstanding, he stammered. Shaq cocked his head. A misunderstanding? Nah. He smirked. It was a test, and you failed. Rick's knees nearly buckled. His hands twitched at his sides. Sir. He turned desperately to Coleman. You can't let him do this. I've worked here for years. Coleman finally looked at him. Really looked at him. Yeah, he said slowly, shaking his head. And in all those years, logically, how many people did you scam, Rick? Rick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Behind them, a few of the other mechanics had gathered, arms crossed. One of them, a wiry man with grease-stained hands, snorted. Too many. Rick whipped around. You're joking, right? His voice was getting higher, more desperate. You guys have my back, don't you? No one spoke. The silence was deafening. Shaq finally straightened up, looming over Rick. Here's the deal, he said, voice calm but firm. I don't like scammers, and I sure as hell don't want one working in my shop. Rick backed up instinctively. Wait, you can't fire me, can you? Shaq grinned. I own the place now. Rick felt the blood drain from his face. You don't understand. I need this job. Shaq let out a low chuckle. Oh, now you care about jobs? What about the people who walked in here thinking they'd get an honest repair? What about the customers you bled dry with fake fixes? Rick's chest heaved. I was just doing what I had to. Business is tough, man. Shaq's smile faded, his expression turning serious. Yeah? Try working 3 jobs to feed your family. Try hustling the right way. Rick swallowed hard, his back hitting the tool rack behind him. The room was so quiet, Rick could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Coleman finally exhaled. I should have fired you a long time ago, he admitted. But I let it slide. That was my mistake. He nodded toward Shaq. Looks like someone finally did what I didn't. Rick's eyes darted around the room. The walls were closing in. Come on, man, he said weakly. There's got to be another way. Shaq tilted his head, thinking. Then his lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Actually, he said, I got an idea. A slow clap echoed through the shop. One pair of hands, then another, then another. Rick turned, confusion and panic mixing on his face as a group of mechanics stepped forward from the back of the shop. Their expressions were a mix of amusement, relief, and long-suppressed satisfaction. We've been waiting for this moment, one of them said, grinning ear to ear. A younger mechanic, no older than 25, wiped grease from his hands and chuckled. Man, Rick, you had this coming for a long time. Rick's mouth fell open. He looked from face to face, searching for even a single ally. But there were none. Another mechanic, an older man with a thick mustache, shook his head. You've been overcharging customers for years, Rick. Taking cash under the table, making us lie to people. He glanced at Shaq and gave him a nod of appreciation. And this guy just saved this place. Rick stumbled back a step. I was just doing what I had to. His voice cracked. Business is tough, okay? We had to keep the shop running. The older mechanic let out a bitter laugh. Rick, you weren't keeping the shop running. You were keeping your wallet full. Rick swallowed hard. The weight of the room was shifting against him fast. Too fast. Shaq, who had been standing silently, arms crossed, finally stepped forward. His massive frame seemed to cast a shadow over Rick, making him look even smaller than he already did. So, Shaq said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. What should I do with him? Rick's eyes widened in terror. Come on, man. His hands went up in surrender. We can work something out. I'll change. Shaq just stared. I swear. Rick's voice wasn't as confident as it had been earlier. I'll give people fair prices. I won't scam nobody anymore. I can help the business. The employees behind him burst into laughter. You? The younger mechanic scoffed. Dude, you are the problem. Rick whirled around, desperate now. Guys, listen, I can fix this. The mustached mechanic raised an eyebrow. Fix it? Like you fixed that lady's perfectly good brakes last week? Charged her $900 for nothing? Rick's face went pale. The room went quiet again. Shaq finally moved, stepping forward until he was inches from Rick. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You scammed people who trusted you, Shaq said. Took advantage of folks who came in here just looking for an honest fix. He shook his head. And now that you're the one in trouble, you want to play the victim? Rick opened his mouth, but no words came out. Shaq sighed. You know what, Rick? You might be right. Rick's eyes lit up with hope. Yeah? Yeah. I can change, man. Shaq tilted his head. A slow, knowing smirk formed on his lips. Actually, he said, drawing out the word, I got an idea. Rick's breath caught in his throat. The employees leaned in, curious and amused. Shaq turned to one of the mechanics. Y'all still need a janitor? Rick's stomach dropped. The mustached mechanic grinned. We sure do. Shaq turned back to Rick, reached behind the counter, and pulled out a broom. He held it out. Rick stared at it like it was a loaded gun. You want to stay? Shaq said, his voice light but firm. Start from the bottom. He shook the broom slightly. Janitor positions open. The entire shop erupted into laughter. Rick turned red. You're joking, he whispered. Shaq shrugged. I don't joke about business, man. Rick looked around, eyes darting desperately. No one was on his side. The younger mechanic crossed his arms. So what's it gonna be, Rick? Rick's hands clenched into fists. His pride was screaming at him to storm out, but where else would he go? Shaq lifted the broom a little higher. Rick slowly, painfully reached out and took it. The second his fingers closed around the handle, the employees cheered. Looks like you finally got an honest job, Rick, one of them hollered. Shaq grinned, patted Rick on the shoulder and walked away, leaving him standing there, broom in hand, face burning, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Rick's stomach churned as he stared at the broom in Shaq's massive hand. His fingers twitched at his sides, his pride screaming at him to refuse. You want to stay? Shaq asked, his voice even, unbothered. Start from the bottom. Janitor positions open. Rick's jaw dropped. He looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up, but all he found were grinning faces and shaking heads. You're joking, Rick scoffed, trying to keep his voice steady. Shaq shrugged casually, like he was discussing the weather. Nah, man. I don't joke about business. His eyes flickered down to the broom. You scammed enough people. Time to clean up your own mess. A roar of laughter erupted from the mechanic standing behind him. Man, this is better than pay-per-view, one of them muttered. The younger mechanic crossed his arms, smirking. Come on, Rick. What happened to all that confidence? Rick felt heat crawl up his neck. He had spent years barking orders, scamming customers, and making himself feel big by pushing others down. Now standing in the center of the shop, broom in hand, he had never felt smaller. You serious? He muttered, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. Shaq nodded. 100%. He glanced at the other employees. Y'all think Rick's cut out for this? A chorus of no way, and man, he ain't got the work ethic for that, rang through the shop. Rick gritted his teeth. He wanted to storm out, but where would he go? His job here was gone. His reputation shattered. No other shop in town would hire him after this mess. His fingers curled tightly around the broom handle. The humiliation was unbearable, but deep down, he knew he had no other choice. You got a problem, Rick? Shaq asked, raising an eyebrow. Rick forced himself to look up. His voice came out flat, empty. No problem. Shaq smirked. Good, then get to work. The shop exploded in cheers and laughter as Rick, the once arrogant, scamming mechanic, became the one sweeping the floors. Rick lowered his head, swallowed his pride, and pushed the broom forward. And for the first time in years, he was actually doing honest work. The ding of a notification echoed in the shop as one of the younger mechanics pulled out his phone. His eyes widened, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Yo," he muttered, nudging his co-worker. "We just went viral." The video was barely 2 hours old, but it was already spreading like wildfire. A customer had been recording the entire showdown, from the moment Shaq exposed Rick's scam to the moment he handed him a broom. The clip had everything: justice, karma, and a humiliated con man. Shaq just bought a mechanic shop. For revenge? The title of the first viral post exploded across Twitter and Instagram. Within minutes, influencers, meme pages, and news outlets started picking it up. Rick, still hunched over with the broom, noticed the snickers and the way everyone kept glancing at their phones. His stomach twisted. What's going on?" he asked hesitantly. The youngest mechanic smirked, flipping his phone around to show him the video. "Congratulations, Rick. You're famous." Rick's face drained of color as he watched himself in 4K humiliation. His smug confidence, his attempt to scam Shaq, the moment his world came crashing down, and finally, Shaq handing him a broom, like he was the janitor of his own downfall. "Oh, my God," he whispered. Shaq, leaning casually against the counter, raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong, Rick?" Rick couldn't respond. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, hundreds of notifications flooded his screen. Messages from friends, former co-workers, even people he hadn't spoken to in years. "Bro, is this you? Dude, you're all over the internet. Man, you scammed Shaq. What were you thinking?" He could barely breathe. By the next morning, news outlets had picked up the story. Major headlines appeared on social media and news broadcasts. TMZ, NBA legend Shaq turns tables on shady mechanic, buys entire shop on the spot. ESPN, Shaq's off-court plays. Just as legendary, watch him take down a scam artist. Twitter trends, # Shaq buys a shop. Rick the scammer. Instant karma people. Dug up reviews from past customers who had been overcharged or scammed at the shop. And the internet turned Rick into a walking meme. One clip showing him frozen in shock as Shaq handed him the broom became the internet's new favorite reaction image. When you realize karma works fast. POV. You tried to scam the wrong guy. Rick about to start the cleanest floors in history. Even news anchors couldn't keep a straight face. On one morning broadcast, the host chuckled as she played the clip, shaking her head. "You'd think by now people would know. You don't mess with Shaq." Her co-host smirked. "Man, he didn't just get fired, he got demoted to janitor." Rick sat frozen in his tiny apartment, staring at his phone. His name was everywhere. It wasn't just his job that was gone. His reputation was destroyed. No shop in the city would ever hire him again. "Bro," his friend texted, "I think you just got memed for life." Rick groaned, burying his face in his hands. Shaq watched everything unfold with amusement. He wasn't the type to ruin someone's life, but he hoped Rick learned his lesson. One of the mechanics laughed, holding up his phone. "Boss, someone just made a remix of Rick getting the broom. They auto-tuned it." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, the internet works fast." A news anchor smirked, looking straight at the camera. "Looks like Shaq's teaching another life lesson. One scammer at a time." Weeks had passed since Shaq had taken over the shop, and the transformation was nothing short of incredible. What was once a shady, run-down mechanic shop had now become a clean, well-organized business that people actually trusted. Shaq pulled into the lot, stepping out of his SUV. The atmosphere felt completely different. The moment he walked inside, he noticed the changes: freshly painted walls, new equipment, and mechanics who actually looked happy to be there. "Boss!" One of the younger mechanics grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't think you'd come back so soon." Shaq smirked. "Had to make sure y'all were keeping things right." The shop was busier than ever. Customers sat comfortably in the newly renovated waiting area, drinking free coffee instead of waiting in frustration. A few of them glanced up, recognizing Shaq, and whispered excitedly, At the counter, the new manager, Tony, stood with his arms crossed, watching over everything. He was a seasoned mechanic, one of the few who had stayed behind after Shaq took over. Unlike Rick, Tony actually knew how to run an honest business. "Big guy," Tony called out, walking over with a wide smile. "Good to see you." Shaq shook his hand. "Looking good in here, man. Real good." Tony chuckled. "Yeah, well, once we scrubbed off all of Rick's dirt, this place started running like it should have all along." Shaq nodded, scanning the shop. The employees moved with purpose, efficiency, and confidence. There was no more fear, no more scams, just real work. "You saved this place, Shaq," Tony said, leaning on the counter. "We were drowning before you stepped in." Shaq shrugged. "Nah, man. Y'all just needed a fresh start." As Shaq turned to look around, he noticed something missing. Or rather, someone. "No sign of Rick, huh?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Tony let out a dry laugh. "Man, that fool ran out of here the second he realized nobody was going to save him. Tried to talk his way back in, but nobody wanted him around." Shaq smirked. "What's he up to now?" Tony exchanged a glance with another mechanic who chuckled. "Word is he's running a pop-up car wash across town." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "A car wash?" Tony grinned. "Yeah, guess that broom you gave him made him rethink his career choices." Shaq let out a booming laugh. "Man, at least he's still in the business of cleaning up." The mechanics around them burst into laughter. Shaq took one last look at the shop. His shop. It was more than just a business now. It was a symbol of what leadership could do when it was done right. He clapped Tony on the back. "Keep this place running fair, man." Tony nodded. "You got it, boss." As Shaq turned to leave, he smiled. Sometimes all you need is new leadership. A month had passed since Shaq's unexpected takeover of the mechanic shop, and life had moved on. But as he drove down the familiar road, something made him slam the brakes. There, in bold letters on a fresh new billboard outside the shop, were words that made him grin. "Under new ownership, honest repairs, fair prices." Shaq chuckled to himself. "Now that's what I like to see." Curious, he pulled into the lot, stepping out of his SUV. Gone were the shady vibes, the ripped banners, and the feeling of dishonesty. Instead, the place looked refreshed and alive. The moment he stepped inside, a group of mechanics whipped their heads around, eyes lighting up. "Boss, you gotta see this!" one of them called out excitedly. Shaq raised an eyebrow, but followed. He wasn't expecting what came next. Inside the office stood a familiar face, an older mechanic named Lou. Lou had been working at the shop for years, always overshadowed and bullied by Rick, but now he stood tall behind the counter, his name proudly displayed on the manager's nameplate. Shaq crossed his arms. "Lou, man, this your spot now?" Lou nodded, a proud yet humble smile on his face. "Yeah, big guy. When you cleaned house, Tony recommended me. Business is booming now." Shaq glanced around at the busy garage, where mechanics worked diligently, customers smiled, and the place felt like a real business, one built on trust. "You deserve it," Shaq said, shaking Lou's hand. Lou chuckled. "You know, ever since you took over, people actually trust us again. We got customers driving from towns away just 'cause they know they won't get scammed." Shaq grinned. "Glad to hear it. And what about Rick?" Lou exchanged a look with another mechanic, who smirked. "Last we heard," the mechanic said, barely holding in his laughter, "he's running a pop-up car wash across town." Shaq let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "A car wash?" Lou nodded. "Yeah, guess you handing him that broom really inspired him." Shaq shook his head with amusement. "At least he's still in the business of cleaning up." Just as Shaq was about to leave, the shop's front door creaked open. A man hesitantly stepped in, glancing around with uncertainty. His clothes were worn, his hands rough. A working man, struggling to get by. He approached the counter, his voice low. How much for a transmission fix? My truck's been acting up, but I ain't got much right now." The cashier hesitated, looking at Lou, who looked at Shaq. Without missing a beat, Shaq gestured toward the register. "Put it on my tab." The customer's eyes widened. "Wait, you're Shaq?" Shaq just smiled, shaking his head. "Nah, man. Just a guy who believes in good business. As he walked out of the shop, Lou watched him go, shaking his head with admiration. Fixing a car was easy. Fixing a broken business? That took real leadership.